Process it, Linda. Mark's finger tapped the withdrawal form, covering the string of numbers. $200,000. If I pressed the confirm button, the special printer behind the counter would produce a cashier's check. The woman sitting in front of me could put it in her handbag and walk out the door. After that, no matter whether we called the police, investigated, or apologized, there would be no way to make that cashier's check walk back on its own. I moved my hand away from the keyboard. I won't process it. Mark stared at me for 2 seconds. He was the new manager of our branch, 41 years old, and he had been there for less than 8 months. He liked to leave the cuffs of his shirt showing outside his suit jacket, and he also liked to stand behind other people's chairs when he spoke. That way, he did not have to raise his voice to remind you who the manager was. What did you just say? That woman is not Margaret Reed. The woman at the counter looked up. She wore a large pair of dark glasses, and her gray-white hair was neatly combed back. In front of her was a state-issued photo ID. The name, date of birth, and address all matched the information in the computer. The photograph on the ID also looked somewhat like her. But she was not Margaret. My name is Linda. I was 58 that year, and I had worked at that Riverside Community Bank branch for 23 years. Margaret came in at least twice every month. She did not use mobile banking, and she refused to use an ATM for any transaction over $100. She always said a machine would not remind her if she entered the wrong amount. I knew the way she tilted slightly to the left when she spoke. I knew the red leather handbag she had used for more than 10 years. I also knew the old watch on her right wrist that ran 3 minutes slow. The woman in front of me was not wearing that watch. More importantly, Margaret had been in the branch the previous Tuesday. A blue brace had covered her right wrist because she had fallen outside her front door the day before. She complained that the brace made it difficult for her to write a check, and she asked me to fold her receipt and put it in her red handbag. The woman at my counter had 2 perfectly uninjured wrists. A man in a gray suit stood beside her. He looked to be around 40 and kept a set of car keys in his hand. When they entered, he said he was Margaret's nephew and that he had driven her to the bank that day. My aunt already gave you her ID. He looked at the clock on the wall. We have to be at the title company before 11. What else do you need? A second form of identification, I said. The woman lowered her head and searched through her handbag. I didn't bring one. Her voice was quiet, and her answer was short. Since entering the bank, the man in the gray suit had done most of the talking for her. I looked at her. Mrs. Reed, where is the wrist brace you were wearing last week? The woman's hand stopped inside her bag. The man answered immediately. The doctor told her she could remove it yesterday. I asked her. He stepped half a step forward. Are you interrogating your own customer? It was Friday, the day pension payments and paychecks were deposited. More than a dozen people were already waiting in the lobby. The ticket machine near the entrance produced another slip of paper every few seconds, and people in the waiting area had begun checking the time. Mark hated scenes like that. When he came behind me, he looked at the length of the line before he looked at the ID. What's the problem? Her identity can't be confirmed. She has identification. I know the real account holder. This isn't her. Mark picked up the ID and compared it with the woman for several seconds. The photograph was taken 4 years ago. It's normal for someone to change her hairstyle. It isn't about her hairstyle. The man in the gray suit let out a loud sigh. I knew this would happen. You always say you want to protect elderly customers, but when an elderly woman wants to withdraw her own money, she first has to prove that she hasn't gotten older. 2 people in the waiting area turned their heads. Mark immediately lowered his voice. Sir, we'll take care of it. Then he leaned down and said to me, the basic information matches, and the signature has also been accepted. Continue. I did not move. $200,000 was not an ordinary withdrawal. It was almost all of the money Margaret had available in that account. Her largest previous counter transaction had been $12,000 to replace her roof. That time, she called me 3 days in advance and brought the contractor's estimate with her to the bank. Today, for the first time, she supposedly wanted to withdraw $200,000, but she had not personally said why she wanted it. I turned to the woman at the counter. Mrs. Reed, who should this cashier's check be made payable to? She looked at the man beside her. The man answered, "Lakeview Title Services. The documents are right here." He pushed a folder toward me. On top was a real estate transaction statement. The paper looked new and Margaret's full name had been written on the signature line. I had seen Margaret's signature. Since her hand had begun to tremble, she only wrote her first initial and last name. After she started wearing the brace the previous week, even those few letters had become crooked. The signature on the document was long and steady, as though someone had slowly copied the sample from the back of her identification. "I need to call the telephone number registered on the account to confirm this transaction," I said. The man in the gray suit immediately took out his phone. "Her old number has been disconnected. Call this one." "I can only call the number already registered with the bank." "Didn't you understand me? That number has been disconnected. If it has been disconnected, no one will answer." I reached for the telephone on the desk. Mark put his hand on the receiver. "Linda, come over here." He called me to the space between two teller stations, only a few steps from the customers. I could still see the man in the gray suit. He was speaking quietly to the woman, barely moving his lips. "Do you have direct evidence that the ID is fake?" Mark asked. "No, but I have enough reason to pause the transaction." "Because you remember that she wore a wrist brace last week?" "Because she doesn't look like Margaret. She can't answer questions about herself. The man with her won't let her speak, and he wants me to call a number that isn't on the account." Mark looked toward the waiting area. "Our average wait time is already over 7 minutes today. Headquarters sent us a service warning last night. You are now holding a 76-year-old customer who has valid identification and refusing to let her use her own money. If I'm wrong, we make her wait 10 extra minutes. If you're wrong, she'll file a complaint saying we discriminated against her because of her age. If you're wrong, she loses $200,000. Mark's expression darkened. "Stop talking as if you are the only person here protecting customers." This was not the first time Mark and I had disagreed about something like this. During his second week at the branch, he turned teller processing times into a chart and posted it in the break room. The names of the fastest employees were green. The names of the slowest were red. My name stayed in the red section for 3 straight weeks because I liked to check large checks one more time, and I warned older customers not to read verification codes to people over the phone. Mark had once told me that experience was not an excuse for moving slowly. I did not argue with him then. I had only 21 months left before my full retirement benefits were protected. I did not plan to lose 23 years of service because of an ugly speed chart. But this was not a speed chart. I returned to my seat and picked up the phone. Mark remained where he was. He did not stop me again, but he folded his arms across his chest. I called the number registered on the account. No one answered the first time. The man in the gray suit smiled immediately. "I told you." I ignored him and called again. The phone rang 5 times. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard a familiar voice. "Hello." I tightened my grip on the receiver. "Margaret, this is Linda from Riverside Bank. Is this a good time to speak?" "Linda? Wait a moment. It's too noisy here." I heard plastic bags rubbing together and the wheels of a shopping cart. After several seconds, the background became quieter. "All right. I'm at the pharmacy. What happened? Are you at our branch right now?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No." The woman at the counter began gathering the documents. The man in the gray suit put his hand on her bag and signaled for her not to move. I continued, "Did you authorize anyone to withdraw $200,000 from your account and issue a cashier's check to a title company?" "What?" Margaret's voice suddenly became louder. "No. I didn't buy a house, and I didn't tell anyone to take out money." Mark came to my side. I pressed the speaker button. "Margaret, there is a woman here with identification showing your name and address. She says she is you." "Linda, I'm at Central Pharmacy, only 2 blocks away. Don't give her the money." "I'm coming over now." "Call the police first." "I will. One more thing. Are you still wearing the brace on your right wrist?" "Of course. The doctor said I have to wear it for at least 2 more weeks." "Why are you asking? Take your time on the way here. Wait for the police at the entrance." I ended the call and wrote the time on the front of the withdrawal form, followed by one sentence, Account holder denies authorization. Then I picked up the red hold stamp beside my station and pressed it firmly onto the paper. The stamp did not make much noise when it landed, but the woman at the counter heard it. Her shoulders tightened, and she reached for the identification. I moved it to the inside of the counter. Until we confirm what happened, these materials need to stay here. The man in the gray suit slapped the counter. That's enough. Get your manager. Mark was standing right beside me. I heard the call, he said. But the person on the phone did not pass an identity check. The customer in front of us has physical identification and signed documents. You just heard Margaret say she did not authorize this money. I heard someone on the telephone say that. It's the number that has been registered on the account for 12 years. Someone else could also be using that number. Then that is even more reason to stop the transaction until both identities are confirmed. The man in the gray suit pointed at me. She has already decided that we are criminals because my aunt is not wearing the wrist brace she remembers. I want an apology from her and a written explanation. Mark's jaw moved. At the end of the month, headquarters would decide who would take over the new North District branch. Everyone knew Mark wanted that position. Recently, he checked the number of complaints every morning. Once, he even made us give a coffee voucher to a customer who had shouted at a teller for 10 minutes simply because that customer threatened to post a bad review. He looked at the people waiting in line and then at the man in the gray suit. I am taking over this transaction. After saying that, he reached for my keyboard. I stood up and blocked the space between him and my chair. You can take over, but you must preserve my hold record. Cancel it. No. That is a manager's order. The account holder just denied the transaction. Mark moved a little closer. Linda, your responsibility is to process transactions, not to play detective. Cancel the hold and apologize to the customer. The lobby had become completely quiet. The people in the waiting area were no longer looking at their phones. The coworker at the next teller station had stopped the money-counting machine, leaving bills caught inside it. I looked at my employee access badge. I had used that card for many years, and the edges had worn white. I knew what was coming next. 21 months. If I could work peacefully for another 21 months, my full retirement benefits would be protected. Mark knew that very well. He had reviewed my file during an employee meeting the previous month. I placed the withdrawal form in the scanner and pressed save. Then I turned to face him. I will not cancel it. Mark held out his hand. Give me your access badge. I did not remove it immediately. He said it again. Now. I unclipped the badge from my clothes and placed it in his palm. Mark turned and motioned to the security guard in the lobby. Linda no longer represents this bank. Please remove her from the teller area. No one spoke. I could hear the printer fan, and I could hear the ticket machine produce another slip of paper. The security guard came toward me, but he did not touch me. He had worked there for 6 years and often sat beside me during lunch to eat his sandwich. I'll walk you out, he said quietly. Wait, Mark said. Let her stand near the door. I may still need her to explain what she did. He sat in my chair and logged in with his manager card. I was made to stand at the edge of the lobby, less than 10 feet from the entrance. From there, I clearly saw Mark open the transaction screen. He canceled the hold I had placed and signed his name on the confirmation form generated by the system. Then he picked up the withdrawal form with the red stamp. He looked at it and tore it in half. Then he tore it again. The pieces of paper went into the trash can under the counter. My coworker at the next station looked up at me. I said nothing. I only looked toward the scanner. She followed my eyes and did not do anything, but I knew she understood. The scanned copy had already been saved. Mark printed a new application form and told the woman at the counter to sign it. Her hand began to shake. The first stroke came out crooked. The man in the gray suit said something quietly to her, and only then did she finish writing. The special printer began to run. That machine was rarely used, and it made a low humming sound while it warmed up. The man in the gray suit put the folder into his briefcase and pulled the zipper closed. His right hand remained on the strap, and his body was already turned toward the exit. I looked outside. There was no police car yet. Mark took the cashier's check from the printer, checked the amount, and signed the first authorization line. A cashier's check for $200,000 required a second authorized employee to verify it. He pushed the check toward the next teller station. Sign it. My coworker did not take it. I didn't see the identity verification. I verified it. Where is the hold form? Mark's voice became cold. There is no hold form. Linda entered it by mistake. I corrected it. As he said those words, I saw Margaret outside the glass doors. She was still wearing the beige coat, and the blue brace on her right wrist was easy to see. Her red handbag hung from her left arm. She was walking quickly, with 2 police officers behind her. I stepped forward. The security guard did not stop me. When the glass door opened, Margaret saw me first. Linda, is the money still there? The woman at the counter suddenly turned around. Everyone in the lobby looked at the 2 women. Margaret saw her own name, her own address, and a fake ID with a photograph that looked somewhat like her. She did not shout, and she did not rush forward. She only raised her right hand with the brace and pointed at the woman. Who is she? No one answered. The man in the gray suit turned toward the exit. The security guard moved 1 step sideways and blocked him. The 2 police officers separated immediately. One stopped the man, while the other walked toward the impersonator. Please place your handbag on the counter. The woman did not move. I am Margaret, she finally said in a complete sentence. That woman is lying. The real Margaret took her driver's license out of her red handbag. Then she produced a receipt from the pharmacy. The time on the receipt was 10:17, and the location was only 2 blocks away. The hospital label with her name was still tucked inside the brace on her right wrist. The officer took the 2 IDs, compared them, and asked Mark, has the money been released? No, Mark answered quickly. I discovered the problem in time. I watched him from beside the door. He turned over the cashier's check he had just printed and pressed it beneath another document. The officer asked again, who was the first person to stop the transaction? Mark pointed at me. She initially assisted these 2 people, but her identity verification was confused. I discovered the risk and suspended her. Suspended? I said. Mark looked at me. His expression carried only one message, be quiet. But he had just said, in front of everyone in the lobby, that I no longer represented the bank. I walked back toward the counter. You did not suspend me. You fired me because I refused to cancel the hold. Linda, this is not the time to argue about an employment issue. Then let's only talk about the money. I pointed at the cashier's check he had covered. If you were the person who stopped it in time, why is your first release signature already on the check? The officer picked up the cashier's check. Mark's name was below the amount of $200,000. That is part of the internal process, he said. A signature does not mean the money was released. Of course it doesn't. It still needed a second signature. I looked at the next teller station. She refused. You were not the one who stopped it. My coworker removed the bills caught in the money-counting machine and placed them neatly on the desk. That's right, she said. The manager told me to sign it. I refused. Mark reached for the check, but the officer took it first. He turned to Margaret, and his voice suddenly became gentle. Mrs. Reed, the most important thing is that your money was not lost. This bank will fully cooperate with the police investigation. Margaret looked at him, and then at the empty badge clip on my clothes. You took her badge? Mark did not answer. You were beside her when she called me, Margaret said. I heard her call you the manager. I also heard her say not to release the money. Mark's lips moved slightly. The person on the phone did not complete a formal identity verification. So you would rather believe a stranger with a fake ID than wait for me to walk 2 blocks? This time, Mark did not even mention the internal process. The police officers asked the impersonator and the man in the gray suit to sit separately. Then they asked the bank to preserve the security footage and all the transaction records. Another officer examined the man's briefcase. Inside were 2 more real estate documents bearing Margaret's name and a completed shipping label. The destination address was in another state. The police later told Margaret that they found mail stolen from her several weeks earlier in the pair's car. They also found photographs used to copy identification documents and account information belonging to 3 other elderly people. The supposed title company did not exist. But we did not know those things at that time. At that moment, Mark was still trying to describe the event as a fraud attempt that he had successfully stopped. He went into his office, closed the door, and called the Regional Operations Department. 10 minutes later, he came out and told everyone not to discuss what had happened. He also told me to remain in the lobby and wait for human resources to contact me. I asked him, "Where is my hold record?" "There is no valid hold record." I scanned it. He looked at the scanner. That was the first time he truly became nervous. Mark quickly returned to my station and opened the customer file. The scanned document was still there. The time, the amount, the red hold stamp, and the sentence I had written, "Account holder denies authorization." The system had also automatically recorded the time it was saved. It was 4 minutes earlier than Mark's manager authorization. He did not have permission to delete a document that had already entered the customer file. He could only add a correction statement. So he wrote a statement claiming that I discovered the problem only after he warned me and that I contacted the account holder under his instructions. When he finished, he asked me to confirm it. "I will not confirm a false statement. You no longer have employee status. Then you have even less reason to ask me to sign an internal document." The police officer standing beside us took the statement. "Did you just write this?" Mark did not answer immediately. The officer turned to the final page and looked at the time. "Keep it. We need a copy." Less than an hour later, the regional operations director arrived at the branch. She did not question Mark first. She first retrieved the recording of the telephone call. The customer confirmation calls made from our teller phones were automatically saved. In the recording, Margaret's words were clear. "I did not authorize anyone to withdraw money. Do not give them a single dollar." Then my voice could be heard saying, "That is even more reason to stop the transaction until both identities are confirmed." After that came Mark's voice. "I am taking over this transaction." The regional director removed the headphones and placed them on the desk. She asked Mark only one question. "After you heard the account holder deny the transaction, why did you still sign the release authorization?" Mark said the lobby had been crowded and he had to make a decision based on the identification presented in person. He said my behavior had upset the customer and that he was only trying to control the situation. He also said that he tore up the hold form because the paper had already been invalidated. The regional director opened the security footage. The video had no sound, but the images were clear. I stamped the form, scanned it, and handed over my access badge. Mark sat at my station, canceled the hold, signed the authorization, tore the paper with the red stamp, and dropped it into the trash can. She asked the security guard to bring the trash can. The 4 pieces of paper were still on top. When they were put together, the red word hold stretched directly across the torn lines. Mark stopped explaining. The regional director immediately took his manager card and office keys. She ordered him to leave the branch and wait for the investigation. When Mark passed me, he did not look at me. At the entrance, he automatically touched the front of his shirt, as though he wanted to swipe his access badge. The card was no longer in his possession. But I was not immediately reinstated. That afternoon, Human Resources still told me to go home and wait. They said they needed to determine whether Mark had the authority to fire me on the spot. They also needed to check whether I had violated any rules during the identity verification. I understood the need for an investigation, but that understanding did not make the afternoon easier. I put the name badge I had worn for 23 years, my locker key, and several personal items into a cardboard box. Mark's processing speed chart was still posted on the break room wall. My name remained in the red section. I stood there for several seconds and left the chart on the wall. My coworker asked if I wanted help carrying the box. No, there isn't much in it. There were not many things in the box, but I changed hands twice before I reached the break room door. By the time I reached the parking lot, my fingers had pressed several dents into the bottom of the cardboard. Margaret was waiting for me in the parking lot. Because her right hand was injured, she could only open the car door with her left hand. "Is your job going to be all right?" she asked. "They're still investigating. You saved my money. The important thing is that the money is still there." She looked at the cardboard box in my arms. "No, the money still being there is not enough." She took out her phone and called the bank's customer service department in front of me. She did not lose her temper, and she did not demand compensation. She simply described what had happened that morning from beginning to end. Finally, she asked the bank to preserve the call between her and me and investigate why Mark had continued the transaction after hearing her deny it. After the call, she gave the police a written statement. When I returned home, I placed the box beside the dining table and did not unpack it. At 7:40 the next morning, Human Resources called and asked me to return to the branch at 9. I asked, am I coming back as an employee or am I coming to complete termination paperwork? There was a pause on the other end. As an employee. I arrived 10 minutes early. All the employees had been called into the lobby. Even the people who usually organized cash in the back were there. Mark stood in the same place where he had ordered me to surrender my access badge the day before. He wore the same suit, but there was nothing clipped to his chest. The regional director came to me first and returned my access badge. She said Mark's decision to fire me had been revoked immediately. My years of service, wages, and retirement benefits would not be affected. Then she turned to the other employees and explained that I was the person who had actively stopped the transaction. The $200,000 had been protected because I refused to cancel the warning and contacted the real account holder in time. Her apology was not long or polished. Yesterday, we failed to protect the employee who did the right thing, she said. That was the bank's failure. Then she asked Mark to turn over the remaining documents. Mark asked if they could discuss the matter in the office. That will not be necessary. In the lobby, the regional director told him that the bank had terminated his employment. He lost the North District branch position he had been seeking, and he lost his performance bonus for the year. Because he had overridden a fraud warning after hearing the customer deny the transaction, destroyed a record, and submitted a false statement, the bank would send all the materials to the police and the regulators. The day before, Mark had stood in that same place and told everyone that I no longer represented the bank. This time, the security guard accompanied him to the exit. No one applauded. I was glad they did not. It was not a celebration. There were still customers in the lobby and a full day of work behind the counter. Everyone simply watched Mark leave in silence. My coworker at the next teller station turned on the money-counting machine that had been interrupted the previous day. The machine began running, as though the morning that had been interrupted was finally continuing. After Mark left, the regional director told me to return to my station. I clipped the access badge back onto my clothes, but I did not sit down immediately. The speed chart was still on the wall. I went into the break room, removed the chart, and carried it to the regional director. Will this still be posted? I asked. She looked at it for a moment. No. She folded the chart in front of me and placed it in a folder. She did not promise an entirely new corporate culture, and she did not say that one sentence could repair every problem. But from that day onward, the branch stopped publicly humiliating the employees with the slowest processing times. The police investigation continued for several weeks. The two impersonators were later charged with identity theft and attempted grand theft. Margaret did not lose a single dollar. The bank also confirmed that her information had been taken from stolen mail and had not been leaked by me or another teller. As for Mark, the investigation found no evidence that he knew the two people in advance. He had nothing to gain from the money. He was willing to risk an elderly woman's $200,000 simply to avoid one complaint and protect his speed numbers and promotion opportunity. When the truth came out, he first tore up the record and then tried to place the responsibility on me. 2 weeks later, the bank's headquarters invited me to a meeting. I thought they only wanted me to describe the event again. Instead, a new job description was waiting on the conference table. The bank planned to create a transaction protection training program for elderly customers. They wanted me to train tellers at 6 nearby branches while allowing me to keep my retirement plan. The new position paid 12% more than my old job. The bank also gave me a special bonus of $15,000. The written reason was direct, prevented a $200,000 fraud loss, and preserved a complete record. I did not sign immediately. It was not because I wanted to make them nervous. I simply read the job description from beginning to end, especially the page concerning retirement benefits. The regional director sat across from me and waited. "Do you have any other questions?" she asked. "Yes." I turned the document back to the first page. "In the training, am I allowed to tell new employees that customer wait time is not the standard for deciding whether a transaction is safe?" "Yes." "If a teller questions someone's identity, will a manager be required to leave a written reason before canceling the hold?" "That has already been added to the new procedure." "Then I accept." The day after I signed the document, Margaret came to the branch again. The blue brace was still on her right wrist, and the red handbag was still hanging from her left arm. She did not come to conduct a transaction. She only handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten card. Because of her injured wrist, the handwriting was crooked, and several letters were crowded together. She had written, "Thank you for not pressing the confirm button when everyone was telling you to press it." I placed the card in the top drawer of my new office. The red hold stamp was beside it. Later, when I trained new employees, I never made them memorize my story. I simply placed a redacted copy of the $200,000 withdrawal form on the desk and pushed the red stamp toward them. Someone always asked the same question. "What if the manager orders us to continue?" I asked them to look at the withdrawal form first and then at the stamp. "Protect the real money in the account first," I said. "Everything else can wait until the real owner walks in."